The name of the book is The Pursuit of a Ruptured Duck. And that's a ruptured duck. When I got out of the service at the end of World War II, they gave me a little lapel pin. And as they did with everyone who got an honorable discharge. And it's an embossed American eagle. But some irreverent person dubbed it a ruptured duck, and that name caught on, and so that's what it's been ever since. A frequently asked question is, how long did it take me to do this book? And I guess the correct answer would be about 56 years. Because I was, when World War II ended, I was on Guam with the 5th Fleet. And the 5th Fleet was charged with handling the naval end of the occupation of Japan. So I went with them to Tokyo Bay, and the flagship was the battleship USS New Jersey. And I was on that ship. And when you got a midwatch, which was old sailors like Larry will remember, was the dead of night. And there wasn't a lot going on in the dead of night there in Tokyo Bay. And I had been accepted in law school, and I thought it would be a good idea if I were to learn how to type. So I borrowed a yeoman's course book, and I taught myself to type. And Linda will remember, I'm not bad at it right now. And then I practiced by writing letters home to my mother. And in those letters, I would recount things, experiences that I'd had, and she saved the letters. So that was really the start of the book. I had an early draft of what turned out to be the manuscript of the book, and I showed that to a couple of people, and they thought maybe I should turn it into a book. And then I got smart, and instead of limiting the book to how I personally had won the World War II single-handedly, I decided to include other people in this community, for the most part, in the book. So that's what I did. And it wasn't easy getting them to tell me what they had to say. Many of them didn't really have, it was like pulling teeth. Some of you may have read the Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation. In the introduction to that book, he wrote this: as they now reach the twilight of their adventurous and productive lives, they remain for the most part exceptionally modest. They have so many stories to tell, stories that in many cases they have never told before, because in a deep sense, they didn't think that what they were doing was all that special, because everyone else was doing it too. And that's what I encountered, trying to get my friends to tell me about their experiences. But I persevered and got the stories of many of them, and that's the major part of the book relates to that. The book has 48 pages of pictures, many of which came from the man in the book. Not everyone had a picture to give me. One of those that I tell about in the book is Herman Johnson. Herman's name you may remember. He's been very active civically in Kansas City, and he was with the Tuskegee Airmen. They were the first African-American fighter pilots, and his story was an interesting story, which I recount in the book. Another one, a good friend of mine, whose picture had no pictures, is Clint Kanega. Clint started out on Guadalcanal with a machine gun company of 45, and by the time he finished, they were down to 22, and in the process, he contracted malaria and lost 58 pounds. But I did get a lot of pictures from everybody else. This is the cover on the book, and I'm very pleased to have that cover. It's a picture that was taken by David Douglas Duncan. David is from Kansas City, graduated from Southwest High School in the mid-30s, and he was a Marine combat photographer. And he told about how lucky he was to get on board the USS Missouri. And this is the surrender scene on the USS Missouri. And he, fortunately, the officer in charge of the press assignments was somebody that he knew. So although everybody in the world wanted to get on board to be part of that press contingent and take pictures, David Duncan was fortunate enough to be one of the few that made it. They have a collection of his pictures in an archive at the University of Texas in Austin, and that's where this picture came from. David lives in the south of France now. I had to get a hold of him and get his permission, and then get the permission of the people at the archive, but I finally got the picture, and I was pleased to get that. And this is a picture of David Duncan. It was taken on the island of Bougainville, and as I said, he was a Marine combat photographer. The picture is probably more notable because of the photographer, a young Marine lieutenant named Richard M. Nixon, who later became the President of the United States. This is a picture taken at December 7th, 1941, of a destroyer, the Knox, which was blown up at Pearl Harbor. It's from a book, How They Won the War in the Pacific, by Edwin Hoyt. The man on the left there is a Kansas City doctor named Max Berry. Max Berry was a successful medical practitioner on December 7th, 1941. He had 2 small children. And Max said that that night he and his wife sat up until late and concluded that the only thing for Max to do was to join the Army and fight for his country. So the next day, December 8th, Max went down and joined the Army. This picture was on the island of New Guinea, and the fellow to his right is another doctor named Albert Sidney Johnson. They opened an evacuation hospital on New Guinea, and the very first day that it opened, they were visited on an inspection tour by General Douglas MacArthur. And Max said that the general arrived with a whole retinue of people, reporters and staff, and he said they had been advised that he was very big on latrines. So he said we dug a 10-holer, I think he described it. And he said then General MacArthur pulled up and he got out of his Jeep and he walked over there, and they assigned this Lieutenant Johnson to show him around. He walked over and looked at the latrine and said, "How deep is it?" And Lieutenant Johnson said, 10 feet, sir. And there was no more conversation. He just got back in his Jeep, and there were a few pictures taken, and he went on his way. While all this was going on, of course, we had a lot on the home front, and you've read about Wanda the welder and the ladies who worked in the bombing factories. Kansas City produced 2/3 of all of the B-25s that were used in World War II, and as well as a lot of amphibious craft, a lot of ammunition. And they also, the kids pitched in. This is a neighborhood paper drive, and these are kids in one of the neighborhoods in Kansas City. One of those who went into the service was a fellow named George Turtellow. George was a photographer, and he had a photographer business. In fact, he called it Miracle Pictures, and they had the catchy slogan, "If it's good, it's a miracle." George, because he was a photographer, got into the Army Signal Corps, and when he finished OCS, they had a very high IQ, and they sent him to Harvard and to MIT to work on the development of radar, which was a pretty new thing in those days. People didn't know a lot about radar. Then he went to the Aleutian Islands to help set up radar stations, and this is a picture of George holding with a couple of dogs from the Aleutians. When George was about 50 years old, he died, as did several of the other fellows who worked on radar, and they've determined later that it was a result of being exposed to microwaves and other things. They didn't appreciate at the time the hazards of working with radar. This is Gordon Robertson. Gordon lives here in Kansas City now. He stayed in the Navy, retired as a captain, and Gordon told about early on in his, well, he was one of the first cadets at Olathe Naval Air Station. And he told about how when he got into flight training, one of the things they had to do was learn about night flying. And the tricky part of that was the landings, because if you were flying in formation and you landed, you had to maintain a proper distance from the plane in front of you and the plane behind you. And he was at a Naval Air Station in Rhode Island taking training, and he told about landing there in the dark, and whoever was the flight controller was saying, "Plane on the runway, keep moving, keep moving." And Gordon thought he was in danger of having the tail on his plane chewed up by the prop of a plane behind him. So Gordon kept moving, right on into Narragansett Bay. And this is Gordon's plane, after it was fished out of Narragansett Bay. Gordon was assigned to the USS Hornet, which had quite a distinguished career as an aircraft carrier. Incidentally, later on, he became the skipper of the USS Hornet. Those aircraft carriers had what they called the island in the middle of the flight deck, and among other things, that was kind of a scorecard. And you can see how on the Hornet they had representations there of all of their successes with ships and planes as the war was being fought. This is Henry Block. Henry was with the 8th Air Force in flying out of England and bombing runs over Germany. Andy Rooney, whom you'll remember from, he's the guy on 60 Minutes and Sunday evenings. He wrote a book called My War. He wrote the 8th Air Force was one of the great fighting forces in all the history of warfare. It had the best equipment and the best men, all but a handful of whom were civilian Americans, educated and willing to fight for their country, and the cause they understood was in doubt, freedom. It's what made World War II special. Well, Henry was a navigator on a B-17. They named it Heaven Can Wait. Henry said all of the crew but Henry were Roman Catholics, and Henry was Jewish. And Henry said before every mission, they all went to Mass, and he said, I felt like I was getting a free ride. This is Jim Kemper. Jim, as you will remember, is now the retired CEO of Commerce Bank Shares, and they've been, of course, a long-time client of our office. Jim was an accomplished horseman. He played polo and rode steeplechase over jumps and all that sort of thing. So he signed up for the cavalry, went to OCS at Fort Riley, and then they sent him to Texas. And he had no sooner gotten to Texas than he was on a mare that in the cavalry. He was on a mare that was spooked and jumped, and Jim fell off the horse right in front of his commanding officer, and he was sent to the mechanized cavalry. So he fought the war as part of the 1st Cavalry Division in the Pacific. And it was a very, he had saw a lot of action. The 1st Cavalry Division was an old regular Army outfit. And he was in New Guinea and later in the Philippines. While all this was going on, I got out of the University of Missouri and went to midshipman school at Plattsburgh, which is on Lake Champlain in upper New York State. There was only one class in Plattsburgh, and it was, we were graduating right after the D-Day landings and after all the landings in the Pacific, and we were being given a lot of small boat training, and we weren't dumb. We suspected we were supposed to be part of the amphibious group, and that's where most of my classmates wound up. I was very fortunate. I was sent to SINCPAC in Hawaii. On the way, I stopped off in San Francisco, and I'd always wanted to get to the top of the mark. That was a great place in World War II, but I wasn't old enough to be admitted to the bar, into the bar there, so I didn't get to see the top of the mark. I took an LST to Pearl Harbor, and when we landed there, we arrived at the same time as President Roosevelt, who was there on a cruiser, and he was meeting with General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz, who was ultimately going to be my boss. And when his ship landed, it was the USS Baltimore. FDR was greeted by this gentleman, who was the Vice Admiral and was the Chief of Staff for Admiral Nimitz, who was SINCPAC, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet. And a fellow wrote about what occurred. I didn't see this. We were sitting out in the harbor waiting for things to die down before we could even land on our modest man of war, the LST. And this fellow wrote about how Admiral McMorris here ordered everybody right face, and there was a bunch of admirals, I think a dozen admirals, ordered right face, and 2 of them promptly turned left. And they said, much to the delight of the sailors on the Baltimore, because it just confirmed their own privately held views about the competency of the top brass. And this is Chester Nimitz. He was Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, and I was lucky enough to be assigned to his staff as an operations officer, and that was my great good fortune. He was a fine man and a good person to work for. This is Bill Doremus. Bill, you'll remember, headed Kansas City Southern Industries later on. He was always a railroad man. He'd worked for the Wabash Railroad, and when the war came along, they sent him to India to run the Bengal and Assam Railroad in India. It was actually a kind of a puddle jumper that had been built by a bunch of tea planters, and it was really a kind of not much of a railroad, but it was very important because it carried the supplies from India to the foot of the Himalayas, where it either went by truck or by plane up over the Himalayas to supply the Chinese army. And Bill was the train master for the Bengal and Assam Railroad. The planes that, this was called flying the hump, the Himalayas were the hump. The planes that flew the hump were these giant cargo planes. This one was flown by a Kansas Cityan named Thompson. And that same Andy Rooney that I mentioned earlier told about flying the hump in one of these planes, and he said he understood that it was a dangerous flight, and he said that his state of mind wasn't eased any by the fact that when he got on the plane, somebody had written on the inside of the fuselage right by his seat, "This is a thing you don't see often, 2 engines mounted on a coffin." So he was kind of edgy about the flight, although they made it all right. I had a brother-in-law who was on an LST, And he started out on the Atlantic, and this is their LST on Normandy Beach unloading cargo, and then they came back to the States on their way to the Pacific when the war in Europe ended. His skipper got married when they were in Norfolk, and he brought his new bride out to see his command. And the way you boarded LSTs, they didn't have gangways or any of that stuff. It had a high bow, and they had what they called Jacob's ladders, which was a kind of a rope ladder that you had to climb up. And so his new bride climbed up the Jacob's ladder, and it occurred to him as he was watching all of this that the guys in the small boat that had brought her out were getting a pretty good view of what was going on. So the story my brother-in-law told us he ordered eyes right or something like that, but they all claimed they didn't hear the command. Yes?
What does LST stand for?
Well, there are a lot of, it's actually landing ship tank. It had a tank deck, and on it were tanks, and when they landed on the beach, it let down that big thing on the bow, and tanks rumbled out onto the beach. Actually, it was also known as large slow target. Anyway, this is the skipper of that ship. His son on his mother's 77th birthday drew this, or had somebody draw this cartoon, and this is her climbing the Jacob's ladder. That's his father up at the top of the ladder, and that's the small boat crew down there down at the bottom. Another good friend of mine, known very well to Ms. Steen over here, Sarah's grandfather was Fred Olander, who also flew out of England, and Fred flew 28 missions, almost 28. He was shot down on his 28th, and he wound up in one of those stalags, prison camp. There was a very high attrition rate, and when you finished your assigned number of missions, and you got to come home, and that was a great feeling of relief. And there was kind of a ritual where after they finished the mission that got him to come home, while they kissed the ground, and here are two guys in Fred's crew that had gotten their assigned mission in. This was Fred's bomber after about its third flight. You can see some of the damage that was done. When I was doing this book, and my wife said, you better hurry up and finish it because a lot of these guys are not going to be around to see the book. So I did hurry up and finish it, and it was my great pleasure that Fred and his children and his grandchildren got to see the book and read about Fred. And he died in a freak accident in Florida, but at least he had the book. This is a bunch of Marines on Saipan after what they called the Great Saipan Beer Bust. They had gotten out of action, and the officers and top NCOs put on a party for the enlisted men. They cooked the steaks and drove the trucks, and they got thrown in the ocean by the enlisted men. And these are some of the officers and NCOs, and the guy right in the middle in the back row. You think of a Marine as a great, big, rough, tough guy. That's Bob Hanger, who later wound up in the advertising business, and you can see he's not a very big guy, but those guys were all long on intestinal fortitude. I mentioned Jim Kemper. This is Jim firing an anti-tank gun in the Philippines. He fought all the way to Manila. He got the Purple Heart in Manila, and as I said, he fought a very tough war. Bill Dunn, J.E. Dunn Construction Company, is another good client of our office. Bill was pilot of a Kingfisher. It was a scout plane that flew off the fantail of a cruiser or a battleship, and it was launched by a catapult. And Bill said it wasn't the most exciting part about the whole thing was the takeoff, because they went from 0 to 100 miles an hour in 90 feet. On that catapult, it was like being shot out of a cannon. David Robinson, who wound up heading the burn unit at University of Kansas Medical Center, one of his more memorable experiences was visiting the concentration camp at Buchenwald, and this is one of the pictures that Dave took. He was with an evacuation unit, you'd know him as MASH, in the European theater, where he got 5 battle stars and the Croix de Guerre. And here is Dave with his unit, and the fellow in the middle with the pipe is Bing Crosby. And that's Dave on the right-hand side. Jim Kemper had an older brother, 2 years older, David Woods Kemper. And Jim showed me a letter he'd gotten while he was on New Guinea from David, in which he had been assigned to a headquarters outfit. And said he was still fighting the Battle of the Chow Line, and he said war's a funny business. He said it's a sucker's game. You have to be crazy to want to go to the front, but you read about others, and pretty soon you find out you want to do it. But he, as I said, he was fighting the Battle of the Chow Line. Well, Jim showed me another letter that his brother had written him several months later from Italy, where he was with a reconnaissance unit. He indicated he had gotten away from the headquarters unit, and 2 weeks before VE Day, David was killed on a dangerous reconnaissance mission. And you may have noticed the fountain at 8th and Main, right in the middle of the street. That's a memorial to David Kemper by the Kemper family. Another good client of our office is Tnimic Paint Company, and the CEO of Tnimic, Ace Bean, was on a destroyer in the Atlantic. Here it is laying down a smoke screen off of Anzio Beach. And when the war in Europe ended, all of the Nazi U-boats, submarines, were commanded to surface and wait for a destroyer to escort them to Gibraltar, where they could surrender to the British in Gibraltar. And this is a German U-boat, and that's one of the destroyers in the background. And this is the skipper of one of those U-boats surrendering to the British. And this is the crew of the U-boat. All of those pictures were taken by Ace and given me for the book. I went with Admiral Nimitz to Guam, which became his advance headquarters. And I had always wanted sea duty, so an opportunity came to make a change with a fellow who was doing the sort of thing that I was doing for CINCPAC, which, as I said, was Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet. He was doing it for Fifth Fleet. So I made a swap with him, and the commander of the Fifth Fleet was Raymond A. Spruance, and this is Admiral Spruance. When the war ended, and thank goodness it ended, we were getting ready for the invasion of Japan when the atomic bomb was dropped. And you won't find anybody in that war who wasn't very glad that Harry Truman dropped the A-bomb, and I'm one of them, because I was familiar with the op orders, and I know what the casualties were going to be, not just with Americans, but with Japanese as well. So instead of being a part of an armada that was sailing to invade Japan, as I said earlier, I was part of the occupying force. We went by way of Manila, which was an open city under the Japanese, and it was a great deal of Manila was destroyed, and a lot of their citizens were killed. This is one of the buildings in Manila. And this is a drawing of one of the buildings done by a local artist who happened to be in the Philippines. His name is Jack O'Hara. These are some kids who were getting water in Manila. A dentist named Grant Hatfield was on the island of Zamboanga in the Philippines, and he made friends with a school teacher after the war ended, and she took him to her village, and this picture was taken of Grant with his friend and a lot of the little village kids, and he had this made up into Christmas cards and sent them home, and the caption was, "Merry Christmas from the Hatfields of Zamboanga," which this gave his mother kind of a start when she got one of his Christmas cards. We went from the Philippines to Okinawa, and this is Cliff Jones, R.B. Jones and Company, and he was the CEO of that later. It was the 7th largest insurance brokerage company in the country, and Cliff is still a client of the office in the estate planning business, but he was on a destroyer called the Lucky Loose. And it was called the Lucky Loose because it survived a lot of kamikaze attacks. Off of Okinawa, where there were a great many kamikaze attacks. You remember kamikazes, they were suicide planes. The suicide attacks in the Middle East were not, they didn't think that up. And the Navy never did figure out a way to adequately combat somebody in an airplane that's determined to crash it into a ship. And we lost a lot of ships, and especially off of Okinawa. And the Lucky Loose luck ran out off of Okinawa, and Cliff's ship was hit, and it sank in 3 minutes. And they had these little landing craft called LCMs that their job was to stick around with these destroyers, and when they were sunk, as so many of them were, they fished the crew out of the water, and they called them pallbearers, which was kind of a macabre name, but that's what they called them. But Cliff survived, came home, and as I said, went into the insurance business. I'm there in front of an Okinawan tomb. The Japanese used those for pill boxes. And this is another scene of the surrender aboard the USS Missouri. That's Admiral Nimitz signing the surrender document. And the 3 men in front, that's MacArthur on the left, Admiral Halsey, they called him Bull Halsey in the middle, and Admiral Sherman on the right. Halsey, when informed of the surrender of Japan, was skeptical. He said, "They tell me the war is over," and he said, we will believe that, but if you see any enemy planes in the air, why shoot them down in friendly fashion, was what. This is Art Doyle, and Art was the CEO of the Kansas City Power and Light Company. Also a client over the years of this office. Art, the aircraft he was in there was a Corsair. It was a gull-winged plane that flew off of aircraft carriers. Here he was on the carrier Antietam in Opera Harbor, Guam. But he was he happened to be off Japan the day of the surrender, and he wrote this. On September 2, 1945, we flew a rooftop show of strength at first light over Shanghai and continued with 5 more during the day, causing the Japs to lay down their guns, open prison gates, and release POWs. We had a good day, but MacArthur had a better one aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan. Art came back to Kansas City, and as I said, wound up running the Kansas City Power and Light Company. I went on to Japan and was part of the occupation force and saw the sights, what there were to see. Awful lot of Tokyo was destroyed. A lot of Yokohama was destroyed. When people think of the atom bomb and the destruction it caused, they don't really realize that the incendiary bombing of the cities like Tokyo and Yokohama caused a lot more damage, killed a lot more people than the atom bombs. Those cities were made of wood and glass, and they went up in smoke. But they were careful to not destroy the emperor's palace. You see, it's not your conception of what a palace ought to look like, but they were careful not to destroy it because they knew that the emperor could be a great constructive force when the war ended. And indeed, it was an orderly society. When I went in there, we didn't have any of the kind of stuff that's going on in Iraq nowadays at all. He gave the order to surrender, and that was it. The war was over. Sailors went ashore, and here are a couple of sailors being pulled in rickshaws. We did not leave Japan. We stayed in Japan for years. We fought the war as supporters of democracy, and the United States saw to it that they adopted a new constitution which renounced war and which gave women the right to vote and made a lot of other democratic changes in Japan. While I was there, Admiral Spruance was replaced by another admiral, and this was a change of command there on the quarterdeck of the flagship. The ship in the background is a Nagato, and that was the Japanese flagship when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And it was later, it later went to Bikini Atoll, where it was part of the atom bomb tests, and it was sunk along with a number of other Japanese vessels and a couple of American ships. That's Admiral Spruance saying goodbye to his command. Those are 16-inch guns above him. Those are great big guns. They could fire enormous loads clear over the horizon. And while I was there, I also got to take a trip and a couple hundred miles south of Japan, see an island being formed. That island had started a long, long time ago at the bottom of the ocean, and that was just the tip of an enormous mountain. That was a great thrill for me to be able to see that. So I finished in Japan in June of '46, came home, got out of the service, started law school in the fall of '46, and that was the end of my career in the Navy. I'll just read you one final sentence which tells you why I wrote the book. It was from the Lucky Loose, Cliff Jones's ship biography. As veterans of World War II take the liberty of this world, what they have lived through and experienced in one of the most eventful times of our country and of the world will be lost to us forever unless it is set down and recorded. Hence the book. Thank you. I'd be glad to respond. Yes, Mr. McMullen.
Do you know, Ed, how the Missouri was selected to be the surrender vessel?
Because it was Harry Truman's home state.
Harry made that decision?
Yes, he did. That's why.
Why was it called the Ruptured duck?
Well, as I said, that's just some guy thought that's what we ought to call it. It doesn't look like, I don't know what a ruptured duck looks like, but that
An undersized look, perhaps.
yeah, maybe that's possible. I think those are mainly feathers, Larry. That's not a rupture.
Is your book still available at Rainy Day? Is that?
Yeah, Rainy Day, Barnes and Noble. You can get it on Amazon.com. So.
Ed, was our partner Sally Surridge's father, Wally Berger, in Okinawa?
Yeah, he was. I'm glad you mentioned Wally. Wally was on a heavy cruiser, the Birmingham, and I mentioned the Kamikazes, and they were off of Okinawa. And Wally left his stateroom, his cabin, to get a cup of coffee, and his roommate passed him going into his cabin. And while Wally was getting a cup of coffee, a kamikaze hit the stateroom where Wally had been, killed his roommate, and Wally was unscathed. So there was a lot of that. I mean, he was a very lucky guy. Yes, Marty?
I haven't read your book, although I'm going to now, and maybe this is covered in there, but even if it's not, could you briefly tell us what Matheny Blackwell's role was? I know he served in the Army in Europe.
Yeah, Chuck is not in the book. He's like so many. There are untold numbers I could have had in the book, but as I said, my wife told me I better go to press. Chuck was with the armored infantry like Jamie Kemper, except instead of the Pacific, he went first to North Africa and then to Europe. And he was in some hot and heavy action too. He got a couple of Bronze Stars and a Silver Star, and was a real war hero. And those of you who saw Chuck, he's kind of like that Marine I showed you in the picture. You wouldn't think of him as a decorated war hero, but he certainly was. And thanks for mentioning that. Yeah.
Some historians think that Nimitz was one of the great military leaders of World War II, maybe the greatest naval military leader ever. And I was interested to hear your thoughts about any particular qualities he had as a leader or administrator that just made him unusually good.
Well, for one thing, he was really good with people. I guess a lot like Eisenhower in that regard. And to work for him was a real pleasure, and he treated his people of any rank with respect and made them want to really work for him. But he also just plain made some good decisions, like although Spruance was a commander at the Battle of Midway, Nimitz had a lot to do with the decisions that were made to gamble on where the Japanese fleet was off of Midway. I'd see him, I'd be out for a walk, and here'd come Nimitz, and he'd, good morning, son, that kind of stuff. He really had a fine man, but he was a great strategic thinker, and had then the courage to put into action what he felt ought to be done. He also had the courage to face up to MacArthur. MacArthur, the guys in the Navy felt that MacArthur was great on press releases, and they felt that the Navy and the Marine Corps ought to get a little credit for what was going on in the Pacific. But they had their moments, but he learned to work with MacArthur, and they learned to get along together, which was no mean trick. Anything else? Well, thanks for coming, and
It's very interesting.
pleasure to tell you all about it.